Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you on another episode of a PFC Public Consultation webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about the Irish Forest Certification System. My name is Hubert Inhäuser. I'm a technical officer at PFC International, and I'm happy to be your host on this webinar today. Our agenda, as usual, is the following. We're going to have a short introduction about PFC International. Then I will hand over to my good colleague from PFC Ireland, to William, who will walk us through the Irish Forest Certification System. And at the end, as always, we're going to have some time allocated for clarification questions, if there will be any. So with this, let us start about PFC International. Well, those who don't know, the acronym stands for Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification Systems. We are an alliance of independent national forest certification systems under the umbrella of PFC International. These national forest certification systems, all of these standards which are developed under the national schemes, they are all based on PFC sustainability benchmark standards or international standards. This is a purely voluntary mechanism promoting sustainable forest management through independent third-party certification. And we are very proud that we are the world's largest forest certification system and provider of 3/4 of the world's certified and sustainably managed timber. On this map, you can see our global coverage. Ireland is not that big on this map, but it's a very important member in our network in Western Europe. And just a couple of introductory words for the Irish Forest Certification System. The system was submitted, the system documentation was submitted in October for assessment. That means that the system will go through an independent assessment process. The PFC independent assessors will look at how far the system is compliant to the PFC benchmark standards and the international standards. This assessor yet to be appointed. Today, the same day when we have the webinar now, we opened a 60 days public consultation. So all the stakeholders are welcome and encouraged to submit their comments until 9th of February 2023, and all these comments will be considered by the assessor in the assessment report. Again, I welcome every stakeholder who is interested in the Irish Forest Certification System. Please submit your comments if there's any until 9th of February 2023. And that was it only from my side. And now I am happy to welcome William Marivel from PFC Ireland, and I would like to ask now that William, you share the presentation with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hubert. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your introduction. My name is William Marivel, as Hubert said, and I'm the National Secretary of PFC Ireland. It's my pleasure this morning to present our scheme for your questions and everything. So thank you, Brendan. Brendan Lacey, our chairman, is going to be co-hosting this because he's doing the page turning for me. Now I'm just going to work out how to get that. There we go. Trying to reduce my, okay, very good. So what we're going to be talking about is the actual standards review and revision process, and I'll be providing a bit of forestry, a bit of background on forestry in Ireland and some statistics. The scope of the IFCS, as we call it for short, which is the PEFC Irish Forest Certification Standard. I'll be going through the actual process whereby we reviewed and revised the standard, and I will give a brief overview of the actual standard itself. So the next one, please, Brendan. So first of all, forestry in Ireland, some history and some statistics and what we are currently producing. So next one, please, Brendan. It's important to realise that forestry in Ireland is a very young industry. At the turn of the 20th century, we were down to less than 1% forest cover, and which wasn't great. This was after centuries of deforestation. And some species trials commenced in the early part of the 20th century in a place called Avondale in County Wicklow, which has come to be known as the birthplace of Irish forestry. And these early trials demonstrated in particular the merits of certain Western North American species, which grow very well here. Planting didn't really take off till the 1930s, but then there was a major program really for the last 90 odd years, to the extent that we now have a little over 11.5% of the land area is now forest. And that is now split pretty much 50-50 public and private. Except this year, the most recent survey showed that actually for the first time ever in the history of the state, private forest is just slightly ahead of public forest. The public area is predominantly in the hands of the state forestry company, which is called Cuilta. They own about 400,000 hectares. So, sorry, they own about 440,000 hectares, but not all of that is forested, hence the 49.1% public. There are also today about 23,000 private forest owners, most of whom have entered the industry within the last 30 years. And the commercial sector is predominantly conifer. Principal species are Sitka and Norway spruce, lodgepole and Scots pine, and Douglas fir. But there has been an increased planting of broadleaves over the last 25 odd years. And of that total area of forest, about 450,000 is now PEFC certified, and that includes the entire Glucha Forest estate, 3 large institutional owners, and one private group scheme. And the other thing I should add is that Ireland is very badly off for native species purely by geographical accident. There are only about 25 native species of tree, and only 3 or 4 really are suitable for timber production. And hence we are very, very dependent on imported species to actually make up our forests. So as I said, the great bulk of the forest estate is plantation, established mostly from the 1930s onwards. There are a few areas designated as plantations on old woodland sites, and there are specific requirements for this in the forest certification standard. And there are also a limited number of small areas of semi-natural woodland remaining, principally in places like the Killarney and National Park, where there's some very fine oak and pine forest. As I said earlier, the principal species is Sitka spruce, which grows extremely well in Irish conditions, and that comprises just under 45% of the total stocked forest area. Other conifers make up about another 16.5%, and mixed broadleaves, predominantly oak, beech, ash, sycamore, birch, and alder, make up a further 27% of the stocked area. That the total forest area includes about 12% open space. And as I said earlier, annual planting of broadleaves has been increasing, and the average over the last 20 years has been 24% per year. Which is a significant increase compared to the first 60 odd years of afforestation in the country. It has reached a peak of 40%, I think, in some years of broadleaf planting. Next one, please, Brendan. Thanks. So now we're at about 11.5%, and the target has been to reach 18% forest cover by 2040. But it remains doubtful if we will achieve this, because the planting target of 15,000 hectares some years ago was reduced to 7.5, purely for pragmatic reasons, because we weren't achieving 15,000 hectares. During the 90s, we were. There were a couple of years, I think, where we reached about 20,000 hectares a year. But for a variety of reasons, it's been falling off, and we're currently only at about 2,000 hectares per annum. but public consultation on a new forestry program has just concluded, and we all hope that the new program will help to boost the annual afforestation rates. And there is very much now an increased drive to get back up to the targets, partly to help us meet the government's climate action plan, which includes obviously planting trees. The timber industry is quite a significant one now. There are nearly 60 processes in total, but there are 8 large sawmills and 3 large panel mills, which account for well over 80% of all the timber in the supply chain. Roundwood production in 2021, we produced 4.7 cubic meters of timber, which is predominantly used for construction in the large sawlog category, packaging and panels, etc., in the small sawlog categories, fencing and pulpwood. And the pulpwood is made up of what goes into the panel mills on the one hand, and is what is chipped for fuel on the other hand. The forecast is that with all the recent planting, the annual production is increasing steadily, and the forecast is we're going to be reaching over 7 million cubic meters by 2035, and that increase of over 50% of the current production is going to come entirely from the private sector, because the state forestry company quoted that their production has been flatlining for a number of years because they haven't been afforesting, whereas the private sector has contributed hugely to the total forest estate in the last 30 years. There is obviously a consequent need for the private sector to apply for certification to ensure that the timber processors can continue to meet their 70% certified requirements. Private certification is only just starting to take off. So we're getting there, but slowly. And to help that, we do need an ongoing need to provide a pragmatic and cost-effective certification solution for private group certification schemes. Here, Brendan. So onto the actual forest certification standard. Next one, Brendan, thank you. As I say, we just call it the IFCS for short. PFC Ireland was actually established in late 2007, and the company, now the CLG stands for Company Limited by Guarantee, was incorporated in 2008. We were admitted to formal membership of PFC International at the General Assembly held in Canberra in November 2008. So we've been full-blown members for 14 years now. And work commenced on drafting the first edition of the IFCS in January 2009. That work was completed by the then working group in October 2010, and it was endorsed a year later by PFC International in 2011, December 2011. There was an interim extraordinary revision conducted 9 years ago in order to comply with certain key revisions in the PFC International standards, resulting in version 2 of the IFCS. The only changes to the actual standard were the incorporation of a requirement banning GMOs, genetically modified organisms, that is, and some minor revision to the text of the requirement dealing with forest conversions. The other changes that we were required to make were predominant to the rules for standard setting, which are contained in the actual scheme document as opposed to the standard. So the time came in 2019 to start work on review and, as it turned out, subsequently revision of the second version of the standard, in order to get ourselves into the next 5-year cycle for the life of the standard. And so the endorsement of this current third version will in fact be the first full re-endorsement of the IFCS. Okay, Brendan, thank you. It might seem obvious that the geographical scope of it is the Republic of Ireland, but I am sometimes asked the question, does it apply to the north of Ireland as well, it being the one island, albeit two different jurisdictions. The north of Ireland, of course, is covered by the UK as part of the United Kingdom. I do sometimes be asked. I am sometimes asked that question. It's important to note this is a certification standard, so it's an audit protocol for demonstrating sustainable forest management in the woodlands. It's not a comprehensive forestry manual. It is based on intergovernmental at European level. That's the Ministerial Conference for the Protection of Forests in Europe and the Pan-European Operational Level Guidelines, which have been drafted by that Ministerial Conference. And so it's based on those standards. It's based on our own Irish governmental standards and on PEFC international standards. So all of those are reflected in the IFCS. And it's subject to PEFC International's rigorous endorsement processes to ensure conformance with all of the various standards that it must comply to. The standard is owned by PEFC Ireland, but we don't write it. It's prepared and written by representatives of a wide range of stakeholders in accordance with the principles of Agenda 21. I'll touch on that later. Next one, thanks, Brendan. So I'll just outline the rules quickly for standard setting and revision. The original rules were written in 2010, and as I mentioned, were subject to some interim revision in 2014. Version 4 of the rules were revised in October 2019 in accordance with PEFC International Standard 2001. And there was further revision incorporated in April this year, covering amended voting procedures where sustained opposition persists. That proved necessary. The rules define the procedures and process for the maintenance and revision of the IFCS, including the appointment of a working group and how the group is to conduct business. And the members of the working group are appointed in accordance with the principles defined in Agenda 21. So at a minimum, they must include representatives of the 5 key stakeholder groups which would apply to forestry, namely forest owners, business and industry, scientific and technological community, engineers, and the forestry workforce. Yes, engineers, NGOs, and the forestry workforce. And the rules also provide for the appointment of an independent chairperson and a secretary, neither of whom have voting rights. Thank you, Brendan. So this time around, the working group members that made up the working group from November 2019 onwards, there were 6 forest owners organizations, Quilcher, namely, as I said, the State Forestry Company, the Irish Timber Growers Association, which is the organization which represents the interests of private forest growers, the Irish Forestry Unit Trust, which is the 2nd largest forest owner in the country. I've just seen a question coming in. We'll deal with questions at the end, but they will be listed. They will be noted. Sorry, the Irish Forestry Unit Trust, which is the 2nd largest forest owner in the country. The forestry management companies were represented. The chairman of the Irish Farmers Association Farm Forestry Committee was on the group, and there's a number of forestry producer groups around the country, and they were also represented. And then in the business and industry stakeholder grouping, we had the sawmillers and wood processors represented, and an organization called Board Namona, the Irish Peat Board. The reason why they are there is because they're one of the largest buyers of woody biomass, because the Irish Peat Board owns the peat-fired power station in the Midlands, which is moving away altogether from burning peat. It is still burning some peat, but it is co-firing with woody biomass, which is purchasing as much as it can within the country, but it's also having to import it. And the intention is that by 2025, it will be 100% biomass, and they will have stopped burning peat altogether. Peat, of course, being a fossil fuel. Then there's the scientific and technological community. Teagasc, the Forestry Development Unit of Teagasc being the Agricultural Development and Advisory Board, and the Department of Agriculture at University College Dublin. There's a forestry school there, and one of the academics from there was also represented. Finally, there were 7 NGOs represented. An organization called CRAN, which is CRAN being the Irish word for tree, which is also trades as People for Trees, which is an NGO which was set up about 30 years ago, basically promoting the planting of trees and husbandry of trees. The environmental pillar, which is an umbrella group of a number of about 30 different NGOs around the country. The Celtic Druid Temple, which is a forest owner and is an organization which is going back to the roots, if you like, of living off the land. The Golden Eagle Trust, which is what it says on the tin. It's an organization which is promoting and safeguarding the return of the golden eagle to Ireland. An environmental group from West Cork called the Macroom District Environmental Group. A community group from County Leitrim in the northwest of Ireland, the Save Leitrim Community Group, and an organisation called the Woodland League. And then finally, we only got one forestry workforce organisation, which was nominated by a nominee from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. The forestry workforce is not particularly well represented. There was a Forestry Contractors Association a number of years ago, but they disbanded. So it was hard to get more representatives from the forestry workforce. And finally, an independent chair and a secretary were also appointed. The secretary ended up being myself, PFC National Secretary. Next one, please, Brendan. So the actual revision process, we started with the first meeting in August 2019. Under the terms of PFC Standard 1001, the national governing body, the standardizing body, is responsible for carrying out stakeholder mapping. But we took the decision, because PFC Ireland is very small, we wanted to make sure we weren't going to miss anybody. And so we appointed a steering group to help do the stakeholder mapping. And in the end, we had 10 organizations who assisted with that process. And with that group met twice, as I say, in August and October 2019. And we then held a public meeting at the end of November 2019 to announce the start of the standard review / revision, and to invite nominations to organizations to join a working group. And all the stakeholders that had been identified during that mapping exercise were invited to that public meeting. All 10 members of the steering group were appointed to the working group, which was fortunate because they were already well attuned with the process. And 8 more nominations were approved. An independent chairperson was also appointed at that meeting, and there was agreement reached to appoint myself as secretary to the working group. We then conducted a gap analysis to identify any holes, basically, between the PFC International Standard for SFM, which the 2018 version that is, and version 2 of the IFCS. And the working group first met in February 2020, and there was agreement at that meeting to appoint a smaller technical working group, which we called the TWG for short, which met more frequently and prepared the draft revisions for subsequent agreement by the entire working group at each stage. It was a much more manageable way of doing things that way, because there were, I think, 9 or 10 in the technical working group rather than the full 18 members of the full group. And to organize meetings of the full group was going to be much more difficult. So, I mean, we had a more streamlined number of people at those working group meetings. But as I say, at each stage, the draft was then sent out to the entire working group for their comments. In total, there were 19 meetings held between February 2020 and February 2022. 8 of them were in person and 11 of them were held virtually. COVID had its effect on that. Early on in the process, close study of the gap analysis did lead to the conclusion that some revision at least was required rather than merely review, because there were sufficient areas where we were not going to be deemed to be compliant with the international standard for SFM. And ultimately what happened was that the working group went through the standard line by line and proposed revisions as it went along. And at each stage, the working draft was updated and circulated to all members of the working group for agreement prior to the next meeting. And a final consultation with draft was approved following a full meeting of the group in early June 2021. That draft went out to public consultation on the 1st of July 2021 for 60 days. So the 60 days closed on the 29th of August. And there were a total of 10 submissions received from the public. 6 were from members of the working group itself. 1 was from the Soil Association, which is the only current certification body operating forest management certification in Ireland. 1 was from a forest management company, and there were 2 submissions from private individuals. Thanks, Brendan. So after the public consultation period closed, there were 2 further in-person meetings held in September 2021 to consider those submissions, and there were further revisions in the light of the submissions. An agreement was reached on most sections. However, there was no consensus on some aspects. And during ensuing meetings in October and November 2021, it did become increasingly clear that there were a number of entrenched positions. On the one hand, on the part of some of the NGOs, and on the other hand, on the part of all of the other members of the working group. And it just became increasingly clear that this was going to be very difficult to overcome. And the chairman did devise a number of strategies in an attempt to unlock this process and overcome the impasse. But some of the chairman's strategies were boycotted by the dissenting NGOs. And in a final attempt to make progress, a subgroup, with the agreement of the entire group, a subgroup met to draft a new rule setting out voting procedures. But the rule as was drafted met with sustained opposition from the same dissenting NGOs. So next one, please, Brendan. And in a nutshell, there was disagreement remained regarding 8 requirements, and there are a total of 78 requirements in the entire standard. So I mean, there was significant progress had been made in agreeing the other 70, and also 2 definitions in the glossary. There was disagreement on those as well, and this was all coupled with sustained opposition to various methods that had been proposed in how we might reach consensus. So regrettably, it was ultimately agreed by a majority of the members of the working group that recourse to the disputes procedures was the only way forward. So the revision draft, well, the completed revision draft as far as it got, was ultimately submitted to the board of PFC Ireland for a final decision on the items in dispute, which was in accordance with the disputes procedures. The board of PFC Ireland being the final arbiter. And the board met in March, I think it was, this year, in order to consider all the points raised by the working group members who had submitted proposals. The board adjudicated on them and completed the draft. And the board, in its deliberations, it took into consideration all of the various submissions that had been made by a number of the working group members. And the revised standard was submitted to PFC International in May 2022. Hubert mentioned at the outset that the final documents were submitted in October 2022, but there were quite a number of other documents went in as part of the endorsement process over and above the actual standard. So hence the delay of a few months. Thank you, Brendan. A few words on the actual scheme. The scheme is the overarching document, which includes the IFCS, and the main documents are the scheme document itself, which covers Irish forestry and scheme background, governance of the scheme, Irish forestry legislation, regulation, forestry standards and guidelines. We're in a bit of a state of flux at the moment. I think it was completed in 2020. The Irish National Forestry Standard was completed in 2020. But that document has been largely withdrawn, and the proposal in the current program is that a new standard will be prepared during the lifetime of the new forestry program. So at the moment we have a rather long list of various policy documents, standards and guidelines, and they're cited in the scheme document. But we don't have a single binding national forestry standard at the moment. And then finally, the scheme document covers requirements for certification, accreditation, group certification, and internal audit. And then there's the actual certification standard itself, version 3. Thank you, Brendan. So I won't go through the entire certification standard. We wouldn't have time, but it's laid out in, there's an introduction. There are 8 sections which contain the requirements, and there are a number of appendices. Section 1 covers legal compliance and conformance with the standard. Again, these bullet points don't include all the sections. I mean, there are a number of sections with 11 or 12 requirements. This is a précis. Then section 2 is management planning, which sets out requirements for documentation, productive potential, implementation and revision of the plan. Section 3 covers forest design, creation, felling and replanting. It includes provisions relating to assessment of environmental impacts, location and design, species selection, silvicultural systems and forest conversion. Section 4 is forest operations, general forest operations, harvesting operations and forest roads. Section 5 covers protection and maintenance, and has requirements relating to planning, plant protection, including biological control agents and fertilizers, fencing and waste management. Again, there's 11 or 12 requirements in that, maybe more than that one. I can't remember off the top of my head. So it is a fairly detailed document. And then section 6 deals with conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. So it deals with the protection of rare species and habitats, maintenance of biodiversity and ecological functions, conservation of semi-natural woodlands and plantations and old woodland sites, which I mentioned at the beginning, and on game management. And then section 7 is the community, which deals with consultation, forest access and recreation, sites with recognized specific historical and cultural or spiritual significance, rural economy, minimizing adverse impacts from operations, complaints procedures and provisions relating to scientific research and how they should be included. And then finally, the forestry workforce, health and safety, it's obviously extremely important, training and continuing development, workers' employment rights and insurance. Workers' employment rights has been expanded to include migrant workers, who are a feature more and more in Irish forestry. And the way it's set out is that every requirement also includes example means of verification, so that auditors to give them a guidance on how to verify that the management plan, the management is in accordance with the standard, and guidance notes for each one as well, which in part are fairly full and complete, I think. Okay, next slide. Thanks. The main revisions, in general, requirements and guidance notes have been updated and adapted where thought appropriate. Some of the changes were very minor editorial changes, and others were more comprehensive. And the revised standard is obviously intended to reflect adequately the PFC International Standard for forest management, which is PFC Standard 2003. And it also attempts to address what have become the most pressing global challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, forest resilience, enhancing the forest's natural capital value, and safeguarding the provision of valuable ecosystem services. And just by way of example, there are now requirements to identify climate positive practices to increase efficiency in forest operations and thereby reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to enhance carbon storage. Okay, next one. Finally, and this is by way of explanation, trees outside forests. This is contained in Appendix 2 of the 2018 International Standard for SFM. It's headed Guidelines for the Interpretation of Requirements for Trees Outside Forests, and this is a new venture for PFC in recognition that trees outside forests can enter the timber supply chain, and there's a requirement in certain parts of the world for this to be certified as well. And the working group did consider this provision, and while obviously there are many instances of trees outside forests in Ireland, the question centered on whether there was any likelihood of a demand for them to be included in any certification scheme. And ultimately the conclusion was that this was highly unlikely to occur during the next 5 years, but that this would be reviewed as circumstances changed. So accordingly, the current revision does not address or include any requirements relating to TOF. We compared this, for example, with the UK, where I understand, where they have included TOF in the latest incarnation of United Kingdom Woodland Assurance Standard. But this is because in the UK, a number of local authorities dealing with urban trees felt the need to put those urban trees into the certified supply chain. I think we're a long way off that happening here. So, if it does happen within the next 5 years, then obviously the group will have to reconvene to draft something for approval. But it's not very likely. So I think that's the last slide. It is. So it's now question and answer time, or question time anyway. We hope we can answer the questions.
Thank you so much first, William, from my side for the well structured and very detailed presentation. I think it was very, very good and gave a very good overview about the Irish situation and so on. Just because it was on the last slide, let me quickly reflect on the TOF part. It's not unlikely or not unusual, let's say, that there's a national system which not yet able to pinpoint on the concrete areas for TFT utilization. Besides the UK, we have only a handful of countries who are dealing with this. And I think that those experiences will potentially help also to identify in Ireland maybe potential ways to how to mobilize it better. But I see that there were some interest for clarification questions. Now I would like to open the floor. Please raise your hand if you have any clarification questions about the Irish forest certification systems for William. And maybe until you do think about it, I have a question myself. I was very happy to see that you already included in the standard provisions these climate positive practices, because I assume that the reason that you address them because the conifer stands are a bit more exposed to the climate change impacts in Ireland, I guess. So I just wanted to ask that with these climate positive practices, if you could share a couple of examples, what is meant by these when the certificate holder should identify those.
Yes, Hubert. Well, first of all, hang on a second now. Where's the, for example, if I can find them, I should have prepared for this question.
I'm happy to read the standards also myself later on.
Yeah, no, I know you're absolutely right. Basically, there is provision for forest resilience, certainly, to ensure that we don't put all our eggs into one basket. I mean that has been happening anyway. In that all new planting is a mixture of species now, and reforestation is a mixture of species. But there's emphasis on identifying species that will be more resilient in the light of climate change. There's increased emphasis on efficiency and harvesting efficiency and reducing fuel use, etc., etc. Examples like that. There's increased emphasis on the importance of water. It's off the top of my head, but anyway, yeah. Come back to me anyway, and anybody else who wants the same question, come back to me.
All right, I don't see any hands raised. I think concludes for the day. So William, thank you so much for the well-prepared presentation again. And I think if just to make sure for all the participants and for anybody who will watch the video online, William and myself, we are happy to answer the questions if we receive them. And in addition, I would strongly encourage everyone to look at the Irish standard. Thank you so much. Have a nice day and goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.